Racist cop slaps the wrong. Black judge. 4 minutes later. Their empire crumbles. They say a single moment can spark an inferno, one careless act that destroys everything in its path. Tonight, beneath the glow of streetlights in a city on the brink, a single slap ignites a blaze of scandal, retribution, and downfall. A white cop, high on power and prejudice, dares to lay a hand on a black stranger. Except this is no ordinary person. She's a respected judge, a force of justice, and she will not be silenced. In just 4 minutes, the cop's once invincible world will unravel. If you crave truth drama and the ultimate reckoning, keep watching, because this story changes everything. The city of Fairbridge had 2 faces, one for postcards and politicians, and another for those who lurked in its shadowy alleys. By day, the downtown shone with gleaming high-rises, sunlit parks, and bustling coffee shops. Tourists snapped pictures against the bronze statue of its founding father, and local families strolled along the scenic waterfront. But by night, that picture-perfect glow faded, revealing an underbelly crawling with desperation, corruption, and hearts hardened by years of neglect. This dual identity did something peculiar to its people. Hope lived right alongside cynicism, and a gritty determination shared the streets with a quiet despair. But no one was more aware of the city's hidden side than the residents of the Cedar Grove neighborhood. Tucked away from the glamorous downtown Cedar Grove was a collection of cramped apartments, flickering streetlights, and single moms struggling to keep food on the table. Police cars made more rounds there than in the rest of Fairbridge, combined often stirring controversy with allegations of racial profiling and rough tactics. Folks whispered about hush money, shady deals, and an untouchable network that protected the powerful. Nowhere was this aura of impunity more visible than in the local police precinct. A hush fell whenever Captain Donovan Roy strode through the hallways. His presence commanded both fear and loyalty. He was rumored to have friends in high places, from the mayor's office to business tycoons. Old money, new money, it didn't matter. Rumor had it that Donovan Roy pulled the strings with an iron fist hidden beneath a crisp uniform. His subordinates included Sergeant James Jimmy McNabb, the man at the center of a storm about to break. With a self-assured swagger and a deep-seated hatred for anyone he deemed lesser, Jimmy was a ticking time bomb, and nobody was ready for what would happen once he exploded. Jimmy McNabb was the product of a legacy that thrived on power and control. Raised in a household that revered the good old days, he heard daily laments about how the city had become too soft and how certain people were ruining the fabric of Fairbridge. His father, also a policeman, had faced multiple brutality accusations, but always dodged consequences. Each time he emerged unscathed, the family simply laughed off the allegations, calling them falsified stories from troublemakers. By the time Jimmy entered the police academy, he was already carrying a toxic brew of entitlement and prejudice. Early on, he impressed senior officers with his physical prowess and calm under pressure, qualities they prized. But behind closed doors, he lashed out with vile remarks, mocking the neighborhoods he was sworn to protect. He believed he was owed respect simply for wearing the badge, a shield that granted him near absolute authority on Fairbridge's streets. Throughout his rise in the ranks, Jimmy never really changed. He just got better at hiding his contempt. His friends on the force were either too intimidated to speak up or too complicit to care. In the locker room, you could catch him boasting about how he taught a lesson to a mouthy suspect, or bragging that his arrest records for Cedar Grove put everyone else's to shame. In the eyes of certain superiors, he was a hero, ruthless, effective, and unquestioningly loyal. Yet in Jimmy's mind, the uniform gave him more than just legal authority. It gave him the right to judge, condemn, and punish on the spot. And so it was only a matter of time before he crossed a line that not even he could talk his way out of. The night he slapped the wrong black woman would prove to be the final spark that lit the blaze. Raised in a modest home on the south side of Chicago, Judge Naomi Harris had come a long way from her humble beginnings. She grew up devouring books in the local library, soaking up knowledge like a sponge. Despite financial hardships, Naomi's intellect and determination caught the attention of mentors who helped her secure scholarships. She was eventually accepted into Harvard Law School, a name revered around the world. Determined not to waste the opportunity, Naomi threw herself into her studies, graduating near the top of her class. Though she had offers to join prestigious law firms in New York or Washington, D.C., Naomi chose a different path. She recognized the power of the law to reshape broken systems from within, and that calling drew her back to an often overlooked corner of the country fair bridge. She started as a public defender, advocating for the most marginalized individuals. Her fierce arguments in court often rattled complacent judges and prosecutors, but Naomi never shied away from a tough fight. Within a decade, her reputation as a fair but formidable legal mind earned her an appointment to the bench, making her one of the youngest judges in the state. A quiet sense of pride filled Naomi whenever she walked into her courtroom. She knew she stood on the shoulders of giants like Thurgood Marshall and Constance Baker Motley pioneers who had cracked the foundations of injustice. She made no secret of her mission to bring compassion and justice to those typically overlooked. Still, she carried herself with a humble grace, not seeking praise or recognition, but simply striving to serve. On the night her life intersected with Sergeant Jimmy McNabb's, Naomi was just finishing a community outreach event. She had no idea how dangerously her path was about to collide with prejudice and brutality. Behind every police precinct and courthouse lay a web of alliances that shaped the city's destiny. Mayor Linda Kingsley, once an outspoken reformist, had found herself ensnared by political pressures. She'd started her term with grand promises, cutting down on police corruption, revitalizing broken communities, and championing fairness. Yet somewhere along the line, her ideals got tangled in a maze of lobbyists and campaign donors. As election season approached, she found herself leaning more on the tough-on-crime narrative, hoping to appease powerful backers like Captain Donovan Roy. Donovan Roy, though outwardly just a police captain, wielded an astonishing amount of influence. He attended gala dinners with real estate developers, rubbed shoulders with local millionaires, and had the mayor's private number on speed dial. Unofficially, Roy was the city's shadow king. Any threat to his domain was methodically neutralized. Whistleblowers found themselves transferred to obscure departments, their careers stagnating. Victims of police abuse were sometimes paid off if they agreed to misplace or forget incriminating evidence. Despite the widespread rumors of corruption, the local media such as the Fairbridge Gazette rarely dove into investigative work. The owners of these outlets were part of the same network, exchanging favors and burying stories. Glimpses of the truth slipped out only when national outlets like CNN or the New York Times picked up especially egregious cases. Even then, local officials found ways to spin the narrative, painting any misconduct as isolated incidents. Judge Naomi Harris, relatively new to the bench, had begun to suspect the breadth of these power structures. She saw repeat offenders cycling through her courtroom, many of whom claimed they'd been framed or harassed. She heard murmurs of hush payments, planted evidence, and intimidation. But Naomi had no idea just how perilous it would be to chase the truth, or how high the cover-ups went. The small community center in Cedar Grove was a beacon for residents in need of legal advice, educational programs, and just a warm place to gather. Its walls were lined with murals depicting the neighborhood's resilient images of families, local heroes, and inspiring quotes from civil rights leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. and Maya Angelou. On this particular evening, Judge Naomi Harris was the guest speaker at a forum designed to inform citizens about their rights when interacting with law enforcement. Dozens of residents filled the folding chairs, a quiet tension in the air. Naomi stood at a simple podium, her steady voice breaking down complicated legal jargon into clear, digestible pieces. She spoke of constitutional rights, lawful police conduct, and procedures that people should follow if they felt they were being mistreated. Though she maintained a calm demeanor, Naomi could sense the undercurrent of fear in the audience. Many of these people had lived through the intimidation tactics of officers who seemed to act without consequences. After her talk, Naomi stayed behind to take individual questions. A single mother tearfully recounted how her teenage son had been wrongly detained by the police multiple times. An elderly man shared how he'd been roughed up for loitering on his own block. Naomi listened with empathy, offering reassurance that she would continue fighting for accountability in her courtroom. It was nearly 10 p.m. by the time she gathered her notes and stepped outside. A slight drizzle coated the pavement, reflecting neon signs from nearby storefronts. She sent a quick text message to her clerk, letting him know she'd be ready early tomorrow to discuss some new cases. Naomi's mind was already busy formulating strategies to address what she'd heard. Little did she know the battle was about to shift from her courtroom to a dark, rain-slicked street. The rain had picked up slightly, casting a shimmering veil over the quiet streets of Cedar Grove. It was nearing 10:15 p.m. when Judge Naomi Harris stepped out of the community center, the door clicking shut behind her with finality. Her heels clicked softly against the wet pavement as she made her way toward her car, parked a few blocks away. The air was thick with moisture and tension, and though she didn't know why, a strange unease settled over her. As she turned the corner onto Oak Ridge Avenue, the hum of engines and the sharp flicker of blue and red lights caught her eye. 2 squad cars sat idling near the curb, angled awkwardly, as though the officers inside had jumped out mid-urgency. Naomi slowed her pace. Her instincts, honed over years in the courtroom and sharpened by countless stories of injustice, told her something wasn't right. From behind a row of parked vehicles, angry voices echoed. She edged closer, drawn by the unmistakable tone of aggression. As she reached the scene, the tension crystallized. Sergeant Jimmy McNabb stood looming over a young black teenager, no more than 16 or 17, who was backed up against a rusted chain-link fence. The boy's hoodie was soaked, clinging to his slight frame. His hands trembled as he tried to explain himself. "I live right there," the boy stammered, pointing to a nearby apartment building. "I'm just walking home." McNabb's stance was rigid, his jaw clenched. Out this late, just walking home. That's what they all say. Another officer, younger, stood a few feet away, clearly uncomfortable but doing nothing. Naomi stepped forward, her voice steady but firm. "Excuse me, officer. Is everything all right here?" McNabb turned. His eyes narrowed at the sight of Naomi. To him, she was just another civilian, a black woman poking her nose into police business. He didn't flinch. Move along, lady. This doesn't concern you, he barked. Naomi didn't budge. I'm Judge Naomi Harris. I'm asking what grounds you have to detain this young man. McNabb scoffed, visibly annoyed. I didn't ask for your resume. Show me some ID or back off before you interfere with an investigation. His tone dripped with contempt. Naomi reached calmly into her purse. She didn't want to escalate the situation, but she also wasn't about to be intimidated. I'm exercising my duty as a citizen and a judge. He has rights. At that, McNabb's face twisted with something more than anger, something deeply personal. Perhaps it was years of unchecked power or a fragile ego cracking under pressure, but the moment cracked like glass. Before Naomi could produce her credentials, McNabb stepped forward and without warning struck her across the face. The slap echoed in the still night like a gunshot. The young man gasped. The junior officer froze. Naomi staggered back, clutching her cheek, stunned by the violence and the sheer audacity of what had just happened. For a second, everything went silent. McNabb stood breathing heavily, his gloved hand twitching. He looked almost as shocked as the others, but that quickly gave way to defiance. He had done it. There was no taking it back. Naomi straightened slowly, her eyes blazing. She wasn't just hurt. She was furious. But her voice remained steady. You just assaulted a judge. She pulled out her phone and dialed 911. In that moment, the roles began to reverse. The authority McNabb thought he wielded began to slip through his fingers like water. Behind them, a group of onlookers emerged from across the street, drawn by the commotion. One or two raised their phones. The camera lights flickered on. The city of Fairbridge and the fragile empire built on fear and silence was about to witness its first crack. The rain drizzled on, indifferent to the storm that had just erupted in the heart of Cedar Grove. For a moment, time itself seemed paralyzed. Naomi stood tall despite the sting across her face, her cheek reddening from the force of McNabb's slap. The damp night air clung to her skin as her fingers gently brushed against the growing welt. Her mind raced equal parts, disbelief, fury, and calculation. She had spent her career confronting injustice in the courtroom, but tonight it had slammed into her with a gloved fist on a dark street. The teenager, still rooted to the ground, stared wide-eyed. His chest rose and fell rapidly. His voice caught in his throat. He looked to Naomi like a lifeline, someone who might still make this nightmare stop. The young officer standing off to the side shifted nervously. His hand hovered near his radio, but fear, confusion, or both held him frozen in place. And Jimmy McNabb, he stood there panting slightly, as if even he couldn't believe what he'd done. The satisfaction that had curled across his lips the moment he lashed out was already slipping. What was once arrogance had turned to something closer to panic. Naomi, voice shaking but resolute, pressed the emergency call button on her phone. I'd like to report an assault. I've just been struck by a police officer, Sergeant James McNabb. I am Judge Naomi Harris. The dispatcher's voice crackled through her speaker, caught between disbelief and immediate concern. Judge Harris, help is on the way. Please remain where you are. That was minute one. By the second minute, the teenager found his voice. She didn't do anything he shouted, as though to clear her of any blame before the chaos swallowed them whole. She was just helping me. Naomi turned to him. It's okay. You're safe now. Her words, gentle but firm, reached through his fear. Across the street, doors opened. A couple who'd been watching from their apartment window stepped onto their porch, phones in hand. Lights flicked on in neighboring homes. Within seconds, several more people were outside, some still in pajamas, others with jackets thrown over nightwear. They aimed their phones toward the flashing lights and the tense scene unfolding. "Is that a judge?" someone whispered. "That's Naomi Harris," another said. "I saw her speak at the forum last month." By the third minute, the atmosphere turned electric. Whispers became outrage. The second officer, pale and sweating, now stepped forward. "Sarge, we need to calm down," he muttered. "There are cameras. That's a sitting judge." McNabb wheeled on him. "I don't care who she is." "She got in my way." She asked a question. The young officer snapped back, the last thread of loyalty beginning to fray. "You hit her." The teenager, now emboldened by the crowd, added, "He was yelling at me for walking home." "She just tried to help." The fourth minute came like thunder. Sirens pierced the air, growing louder by the second. A fleet of patrol cars screamed around the corner, tires screeching as they came to a stop. More lights flooded the scene, red, blue, and white, reflecting in pools of rainwater, and eyes filled with shock. Officers leapt from their vehicles, some already radioing in the situation. Lieutenant Sandra Brooks, known for her steel resolve and clear-headedness, stepped into the chaos and froze. She saw Naomi Harris, battered, but standing, saw the crowd with their cameras raised, and then saw Sergeant McNabb, wild-eyed and trembling. "Is this real?" she whispered to no one in particular. Naomi raised her chin. "Yes, it is." And just like that, Fairbridge's empire of silence cracked live on camera, and with the whole city watching. The cavalry arrived in a burst of blue and red luminescence. Patrol cars screeched to a halt, flooding the rain-soaked street with more officers. Among the newcomers was Lieutenant Sandra Brooks, known for her level-headed approach to even the tensest situations. When she saw Naomi, who was still trembling from the assault, and recognized her as a judge, her expression went pale. The chaos was palpable, bystanders yelling, phones pointed like weapons, and the teen still cowering against a brick wall. Jimmy's brazen act had turned the once-controlled environment into a volatile spectacle. He stood there, chest heaving, adrenaline pounding in his veins. Still in denial, he insisted that he had been provoked, an outrageous lie that had zero evidence to back it up. He ordered everyone to step back, as if he still held the authority to command. Yet the moment his fellow officers recognized the victim's identity, a wave of uncertainty and fear rippled through them. Naomi's voice cut through the din, firm, yet quivering with pent-up anger. "I want him arrested," she said. Simply, her gaze locked on Jimmy. She had no illusions about how the police brotherhood often closed ranks, but this time there was no ignoring the seriousness of what had happened. The second officer, whose face was ashen, corroborated Naomi's version of events almost immediately. Several witnesses had captured the assault on their phones. The evidence was irrefutable. Lieutenant Brooks, swallowing hard, quietly instructed two officers to place Jimmy in handcuffs. He resisted at first, but the mounting pressure, the demands from the crowd, the outraged stares of his colleagues, forced him to comply. As the cuffs clicked shut around his wrists, reality settled in. The unstoppable Sergeant McNabb had just committed a career-ending crime in front of a crowd and cameras, and the tremors were about to be felt throughout Fairbridge's corridors of power. News of Jimmy's arrest spread like wildfire through the police department's communication channels. Radios crackled with hurried updates. Sergeant McNabb detained for assaulting a sitting judge. Within minutes, Captain Donovan Roy was roused from his late dinner meeting with a real estate mogul. Anger flared in his belly as soon as he heard the details. This wasn't just any scuffle. This was a direct attack on a judge with impeccable standing. And not just any judge, a Harvard-educated, widely respected African-American judge who had quickly gained a reputation for integrity. Roy's first instinct was to protect his domain. Throughout his career, he had shielded officers under his command from scrutiny, ensuring that even the most damning allegations were buried. He had called in favors from politicians, quashed internal investigations, and intimidated the press. But this situation felt like a bomb, with a lit fuse ticking toward detonation. The presence of multiple witnesses and video recordings made it virtually impossible to spin the narrative. Mayor Linda Kingsley's phone buzzed incessantly, pulling her out of an important strategy session. The muffled panic in her aide's voice signaled that this was a crisis of epic proportions. How could she possibly defend a police department plagued by rumors of racism and corruption, now that a judge had been physically assaulted? Images of her re-election. Campaign posters flashed before her eyes, and she felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She could already envision the protests, the national media descending, and rival politicians seizing the chance to paint her administration as complicit. At the same time, Naomi Harris was driven to the hospital for a precautionary checkup. Sitting in the back of the ambulance, she clasped her phone tightly, unsure of what to expect next. She had just become the center of a scandal that would soon grip the entire city and beyond. Dawn broke over Fairbridge like a spotlight on a crime scene. The rain had stopped sometime after midnight, but the city remained soaked not just with water, but with tension, disbelief, and a gathering storm of accountability. By 6 a.m., every local news outlet had seized on the story. But it wasn't just Fairbridge talking. National networks, CNN, MSNBC, even BBC World News ran the headline on a loop. Police sergeant arrested after slapping sitting judge caught on camera. The video captured from 3 different angles by bystanders' phones had gone viral overnight. It showed every harrowing second from Naomi Harris calmly identifying herself to McNabb's sudden violent slap to the moments afterward when her hand shakily reached for her phone to call 911. The footage struck a nerve. Not just because of the violence, but because of who the victim was: a judge, a black woman, and a respected figure who had spent her life upholding the law. The implications were staggering. If someone like Naomi Harris could be assaulted with impunity, what did that say about the system? What did it say about the people who weren't judges, who didn't have titles, power, or media attention? The video was a spark. The explosion came next. By 9 a.m., whistleblowers began to crawl out of the shadows. An anonymous tipster sent a trove of documents to several newsrooms, including internal memos, disciplinary complaints, and even body cam footage that had mysteriously gone missing from previous cases. A former officer who had left the force after allegedly being pressured to tamper with evidence emailed reporters a 56-page dossier chronicling years of corruption involving McNabb, and more disturbingly, his commanding officer, Captain Donovan Roy. Within hours, the name Roy began trending alongside McNabb's. Local activists, long dismissed as conspiracy theorists or troublemakers, were suddenly vindicated. Their years of accusations about systemic abuse and cover-ups now had teeth. A cache of emails and internal audits showed evidence of asset forfeiture abuses, where poor families had their homes or cars seized on flimsy legal grounds. Several of those seizures records showed were signed off by McNabb and approved by Roy. There were whispers, too, of a wider scheme, one that extended beyond the police precinct. A city council member, pressured by the public outcry, came forward on live television with her own shocking admission. In a shaky voice, she revealed that Captain Roy had once tried to coerce her into voting in favor of a policing budget increase that redirected millions into a vaguely named community enforcement initiative. That money, she said, never reached any community programs. Instead, it disappeared into a network of shell accounts controlled by police union intermediaries and, according to banking records, Roy's own family trust. And it didn't end there. Another bombshell dropped when a freelance journalist uncovered a private real estate consortium that had purchased over a dozen properties in Cedar Grove at artificially low prices just months after those same properties had been raided by Roy's special ops teams. The implications were chilling. A system that used intimidation and criminalization to displace poor residents, then allowed investors to swoop in and gentrify the land. Roy, it turned out, sat on the advisory board of one of those development firms. Suddenly it wasn't just about McNabb's slap. It was about a whole empire built on fear, silence, and exploitation. Naomi Harris, still resting at home after a brief overnight hospital stay, watched the coverage unfold with weary eyes. She had given a brief statement to the police, filed formal charges against McNabb, and submitted herself to an internal judicial review to preempt any claim of bias or impropriety. But none of that could prepare her for the flood that was now overtaking the city. Calls came in from everywhere, civil rights lawyers offering help, federal investigators requesting interviews, and even reporters from international outlets asking for statements. Naomi declined most of them. For now, she wanted to stay grounded, to absorb the weight of what was happening. Outside her window, Cedar Grove was waking up. And it was different. Residents who had long felt voiceless were suddenly emboldened. They spoke to reporters. They organized emergency town halls. They sent letters to the mayor's office demanding answers and action. A mural had already gone up on a community wall, an outline of Naomi's face, her hand raised not in fear, but in defiance. Beneath it, someone had spray-painted the words, "One slap shattered the silence." Meanwhile, inside Fairbridge Police Headquarters, chaos reigned. Captain Donovan Roy stormed through his office, barking into a phone and slamming his fist against a desk. He had weathered scandals before, whispers of brutality, corruption, backroom deals. But this was different. This wasn't a slow burn. It was a wildfire. And for the first time in years, he felt the heat licking at his own feet. He made calls to lawyers, to city officials, to old allies in the mayor's office. But the lines had gone cold. The people who once owed him favors were suddenly unavailable in meetings, or worse, already speaking to the press. As noon approached, news broke that the district attorney had ordered a formal investigation into Roy's finances campaign contributions and real estate ties. A federal task force was rumored to be forming, and worst of all for Roy, his name had started appearing on protest signs across the city. The empire he'd built, one forged through manipulation, loyalty, and fear, was no longer in the shadows. It was on trial in the court of public opinion. And it was losing. Late the next morning, Judge Naomi Harris emerged from the hospital with a faint bruise on her left cheek, physical evidence of Sergeant McNabb's brutality. Camera crews and journalists encircled her like a fortress of microphones and flashing lights. She paused on the hospital steps, dressed in a simple grey suit that contrasted with the swirl of sensational headlines. Her eyes scanned the crowd, a mix of local and national reporters, before she took a deep, steadying breath. "Good morning," she began, her voice resonant. I stand here not just as a judge, but as a woman, an African American, and a concerned citizen of Fairbridge. Last night I was assaulted by someone sworn to protect and serve. That moment was an egregious abuse of power, but it was not an isolated incident. It represents systemic issues that have plagued our city for far too long. Her words carried the weight of lived experience and a profound sense of duty. She didn't just speak for herself. She spoke for every Swant victim of police brutality, every family who had lost faith in the justice system. Naomi called for an independent investigation into the Fairbridge Police Department, urging the city to embrace transparency and accountability. A hush fell over the crowd. Even the pushiest reporters felt an unspoken gravity in her tone. When she concluded, applause broke out, a mixture of support and relief that someone so respected was willing to speak truth to power. A local activist group leader shouted, "We've got your back, Judge Harris." She nodded in acknowledgement, her heart heavy with the responsibility she had just taken on. As she stepped away from the microphones, Naomi knew her words had ignited a firestorm, and that the subsequent conflagration would be both purifying and devastating for Fairbridge's rotten empire. By midday, City Hall was a frenzy of urgent meetings, panicked phone calls and hushed corridor huddles. Mayor Linda Kingsley's staff scrambled to draft statements that could quell public outrage. But every hour brought fresh headlines, allegations of corruption, leaked documents, and interviews with former officers who had quit in disgust. It was as if a tidal wave of truth had washed over Fairbridge, pulling secrets from the murky depths. Inside the mayor's private office, Captain Donovan Roy and Linda Kingsley faced off in a tense standoff. "You need to get ahead of this," Roy growled, his voice ripe with frustration. He glowered at the mayor, whose once confident demeanor now showed signs of cracking. "If you throw Jimmy under the bus without protecting the department, the public will lose faith entirely. This city will descend into chaos." Mayor Kingsley slammed her fists on the table, her eyes blazing with anxiety. "You think I don't know that? We're already in chaos. Protesters are gathering outside. The media is tearing us apart, and my aides tell me the governor's office wants answers. You and Jimmy have put me in an impossible position." Meanwhile, down the hall, council members whispered among themselves, some demanding Captain Roy's resignation, others calling for an emergency overhaul of the entire department. The tension was palpable. No one wanted to be the next scapegoat, yet no one wanted to appear complicit in the face of an increasingly outraged public. In the building's grand rotunda, activists carried signs reading "Justice for All" and "Hold them accountable." Chants reverberated off the marble walls. A single chant, however, rose above the rest: "Judge Harris for mayor." Though spontaneous, it highlighted just how profoundly Naomi's courage had impacted the city. For the first time, those in power realized their iron grip on Fairbridge might be slipping, and no one knew how to stop it. Cedar Grove became the epicenter of citywide protests as residents from all walks of life, black, white, Latino, Asian, joined hands to demand justice. Marches formed at street corners, swelling in number as they wove through neighborhoods once ignored by local media. School teachers held signs reading, "Protect our students." Construction workers carried banners that said, "No more silence." And small business owners boarded up their windows in fear of potential rioting, yet placed placards in support of Judge Harris in those very windows. At nightfall, the largest march yet converged on City Hall. Thousands filled the surrounding streets, chanting slogans, lighting candles, and holding a vigil for those who had suffered under Fairbridge's oppressive policing. Despite the tension, the event remained largely peaceful, a testament to the discipline and unity of the community. Local activists had coordinated meticulously, ensuring that any confrontations were quickly de-escalated by trained volunteers. In the crowd, an elderly woman who had lived in Fairbridge for over 50 years wept openly, stating she had never seen the people so united. Her words echoed a growing sentiment. The city, despite its deep wounds, was awakening to its own power. Meanwhile, social media exploded with hashtags like #JusticeForNaomi and #EndCorruptionFairbridge, drawing national attention. Prominent civil rights attorneys, including some affiliated with the NAACP, announced they would be descending upon the city to offer pro bono legal support to anyone affected by police wrongdoing. Mayor Kingsley watched the events unfold from a balcony on the second floor, anxiety etched into every line on her face. She understood that if she didn't act decisively, her political career and possibly the future stability of Fairbridge would crumble under the weight of the people's anger. But the big question remained. Could she afford to sever the deep ties she had with Donovan Roy and the powerful interests he represented? Within a week, a flurry of legal motions were filed, culminating in Sergeant Jimmy McNabb's rapid indictment. The district attorney's office, under intense pressure and scrutiny, wasted no time in pressing charges, assault battery and official misconduct among them. Courtrooms overflowed with spectators, reporters, and an unprecedented number of legal observers, many of whom were outraged at how such an incident could have occurred in the first place. Jimmy arrived in court wearing his standard blue uniform for what might be the last time. Gone was the swagger. In its place, a strained expression that spoke of fear. His attorney attempted to argue that McNabb felt threatened, painting Naomi Harris as an aggressor. But the video evidence and eyewitness testimonies crushed that narrative within the first day of proceedings. Meanwhile, Captain Donovan Roy made an appearance in the back of the courtroom, glaring defiantly at the press. He was there to project solidarity or intimidation, depending on the perspective. While he hadn't yet been charged with any criminal wrongdoing, investigations into his alleged network of corruption were well underway. Rumors buzzed that the FBI had been called in to examine financial transactions and internal police records. No one was above suspicion anymore. On the third day of the trial, Naomi Harris took the stand. Poised, articulate, and unwavering, she recounted the night she was struck. Her words carried moral gravity. She explained she hadn't sought a confrontation. She had only tried to ensure that the teenager Jimmy harassed was not mistreated. As she spoke, the courtroom fell silent. Even the judge presiding over the case seemed transfixed. Naomi concluded by saying, "This is about more than a slap. It's about the very fruku of justice and the dignity every citizen deserves." With that, a verdict began to feel inevitable, a signal that the walls of Fairbridge's crooked empire were on the verge of collapsing completely. While the trial raged on, Captain Donovan Roy fought his own battles behind closed doors. He spent hours in meetings with attorneys, trying to fend off an intensifying storm of allegations. Whistleblowers, some from within the police force, produced documents linking Roy to questionable asset forfeiture practices, evidence tampering, and suspicious transfers of city funds. Bank statements showed deposits into accounts controlled by Roy's close relatives, raising accusations of money laundering. Each revelation hammered a nail into the coffin of Roy's carefully built empire. Mayor Kingsley, sensing the political winds shifting, distanced herself from Roy in a public statement. She denounced all forms of corruption and called for full cooperation with federal investigators. It was a calculated move. Kingsley wanted to protect whatever was left of her reputation and appease the swelling outcry. Roy, enraged, felt betrayed, but found himself cornered. His usual channels to quash scandals were no longer available. Too many eyes were on Fairbridge, and too many investigators demanded transparency. Meanwhile, rank-and-file officers faced a dilemma. Many were relieved to see Roy and McNabb held accountable, having grown weary of an internal culture that rewarded intimidation over integrity. A group of reform-minded officers stepped forward, joining community leaders in calling for an overhaul of police training, disciplinary procedures, and accountability measures. They believed this crisis could lead to meaningful change if the city was willing to embrace it. Roy tried to keep a lid on the chaos by intimidating subordinates, but his power was fading fast. Department emails were leaked, revealing attempts to shield officers from investigation. There were even incriminating text messages linking Roy to bribe offers for certain council members. Suddenly, the empire he had forged through fear and corruption started crumbling brick by brick, and he could do little more than watch it all collapse. After a week of riveting testimony and cross-examinations, the jury took less than a day to deliberate. Their verdict came swiftly. Sergeant Jimmy McNabb was found guilty on all counts. A hush descended over the packed courtroom as the judge read the decision. Cameras clicked furiously, capturing Jimmy's face twisted in disbelief. The once fearsome officer seemed small, almost childlike, as reality settled in. He would be stripped of his uniform, and his future held the grim prospect of incarceration. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for a later date, but public sentiment weighed heavily toward a demand for the maximum penalty. Outside, a crowd gathered, cheering as the verdict was announced through loudspeakers. Judge Naomi Harris, stepping down from the witness stand, breathed a weary sigh of relief. She hadn't relished the ordeal, but she recognized the importance of showing that no one, no matter their badge or rank, was above the law. In the days that followed, a domino effect rippled through Fairbridge. Investigations broadened their scope, arresting several high-ranking officers under Roy's command. Some city council members resigned amid revelations of kickbacks and hush money. The mayor's approval ratings tumbled, and a recall campaign gained traction, fueled by citizens who believed Linda Kingsley had been complicit for far too long. For many residents, it felt like a seismic shift in their collective consciousness. The protest signs slowly came down, replaced by cautious optimism. Even the local press found a renewed sense of purpose embarking on investigative reporting that had been absent for years. While the path to healing was far from smooth, there was a sense that something profound had happened. The fortress of corruption had been breached, and a ray of accountability shone through. In Cedar Grove, the place where the fateful slap had occurred, there was a new sense of purpose. Community leaders organized town halls and workshops aimed at rebuilding trust between residents and the police. Lieutenant Sandra Brooks, who had arrested Jimmy, emerged as a champion of reform within the department. She met regularly with youth groups, dispelling fears and encouraging dialogue. Her candid admissions about the department's past wrongdoings won her cautious respect from locals. Meanwhile, non-profit organizations and local businesses collaborated on revitalization projects. They repainted graffiti-scarred walls with vibrant murals, celebrating unity and justice. A pop-up health clinic opened in a shuttered storefront, providing free checkups and mental health services for those traumatized by years of living under oppressive policing. The energy in the air was tangibly different. People spoke openly about the changes they wanted to see: better schools, more job opportunities, and a fairer legal system. Media outlets, once complicit in maintaining the status quo, now published exposés almost daily. Their stories ranged from courageous officers trying to do the right thing to formerly silenced victims coming forward with new claims. Public pressure on City Hall was unrelenting. Even though Mayor Kingsley attempted to salvage her image by championing new policies, most believed her efforts were too little, too late. Many were already calling for fresh leadership. Amid this transformation, Naomi Harris continued her judicial duties, but found herself also serving as a bridge between the courts and the community. Invitations poured in from across the state universities. Civil rights organizations and activist collectives all wanted to hear her speak. Yet Naomi declined many of these, preferring to remain rooted in Fairbridge, where she felt her presence was needed most. The city was at a crossroads, and the outcome of this moment would shape its identity for generations to come. In the midst of Fairbridge's sweeping reforms, Captain Donovan Roy made a final desperate attempt to salvage his power. Rumors suggested he was holed up in a luxury penthouse owned by a wealthy ally, plotting strategies with a small circle of loyal enforcers. He aimed to call in favors from state officials, threatening to reveal incriminating secrets about them if they didn't intervene on his behalf. He also leaned on old political connections, urging them to paint the investigations as a witch hunt designed to tarnish the reputation of a heroic police department. But times had changed. The climate of fear Roy once generated had evaporated under the glaring spotlight of public scrutiny. Former allies refused to take his calls. Some now threatened with their own indictments, considered testifying against him in exchange for leniency. Even the mayor, once so reliant on Roy's maneuvers, had cut him off completely. Desperate, Roy tried to orchestrate a smear campaign against Naomi Harris, dredging up her family history in Chicago and twisting it into a narrative of urban radicalism. But the public had already seen too much evidence of Roy's misdeeds, and the attempt backfired spectacularly. Naomi's supporters rallied around her, launching counters against the false claims. The smear campaign only solidified Roy's image as a man clinging to any dirty trick to save himself. In the end, Roy's last stand collapsed under the weight of federal subpoenas and leaked documents. The FBI, along with state investigators, raided multiple properties linked to him. They seized computers, hard drives, and filing cabinets, stuffed with evidence of corruption. Cornered and out of allies, Roy was left with two choices: surrender to the authorities or flee and become a fugitive. On a rainy Thursday morning, he was taken into custody, his face etched with a mixture of rage and despair. The reign of Donovan Roy had finally ended. With both Jimmy McNabb and Donovan Roy now facing serious charges, Fairbridge found itself at a new juncture. The forces that had long suppressed change were weakened, allowing the seeds of reform to take root. In the following months, community police liaison committees formed, each one tasked with identifying systemic problems and proposing tangible solutions. Academics from local universities, clergy members, business owners, and even teenage activists joined these committees. Their mission was clear: to make Fairbridge a place where justice was truly blind and accountability was the norm, not the exception. Financial audits exposed layers of theft and misuse of public funds, leading to an overhaul of how the city budgeted for law enforcement. Diversion programs were expanded, focusing on mental health and rehabilitation rather than incarceration. Cedar Grove, once synonymous with despair, became a focal point for pilots of new social programs. Public art installations sprang up, depicting scenes of unity triumph and remembrance for victims of police misconduct. Mayor Kingsley, under relentless pressure and facing a strong recall movement, announced she would not seek re-election. In a surprising move, she endorsed a slate of reform-minded candidates to take her place, seeking to redeem her legacy in her final months in office. Whether out of genuine regret or political survival, her concession left a vacuum at City Hall, one that many hoped would be filled by a fresh wave of principled leaders. Throughout it all, Judge Naomi Harris remained a steady influence. Though she could have ridden the wave of public support to pursue a higher political role, she chose instead to continue her work on the bench and serve as a mentor to young lawyers and activists. She believed real change wasn't about glory or status. It was about consistently doing the right thing, day after day, case by case. Several years later, the events of that dramatic night, when a racist cop slapped the wrong black judge, had become a cautionary tale woven into Fairbridge's collective memory. The city had not solved every problem, nor had it completely eradicated prejudice or corruption, but it had made strides beyond what anyone thought possible before that one explosive moment. The police force underwent multiple waves of reform, influenced by community input and guided by independent oversight. Officers underwent rigorous training on de-escalation techniques, racial bias, and community engagement. Civilian review boards held regular hearings, ensuring that any complaints against the police were investigated transparently. Cedar Grove, once overlooked, evolved into a neighborhood of vibrant murals, community gardens, and well-lit recreational areas. Children played without constant fear of harassment, and local businesses started to thrive. A new generation of civic leaders emerged, people who had witnessed the collapse of an unjust empire and vowed never to let it rise again. They fostered partnerships with universities, philanthropic organizations, and think tanks, turning Fairbridge into a case study on how a city could rise from the ashes of systemic injustice. Judge Naomi Harris became a widely respected figure, not just locally, but nationally. She was frequently invited to speak at Harvard Law School, the very institution where she once honed her intellect and passion. Her speeches resonated with future legal scholars, urging them to understand that justice was more than a concept. In textbooks, it was a promise to be upheld, especially when it challenged those in power. As for Jimmy McNabb and Donovan Roy, both served prison sentences. Their names became synonymous with the dark chapter in Fairbridge's history, a reminder of how power, when abused, can devour itself. In the end, the city emerged with a stronger sense of unity and a commitment to equality. And that, perhaps, was the greatest legacy of all. The fall of Sergeant McNabb and Captain Roy proved that no fortress of corruption can stand forever. Their empire, once guarded by fear and silence, crumbled in just 4 minutes of recklessness that rippled throughout Fairbridge. At its heart, this story is a testament to the power of collective courage. Residents, activists, and principled leaders united to shine a light on the city's darkest corners. Today, Fairbridge continues its journey toward justice and equality, guided by the lessons of a single seismic moment. If this story inspired or moved, you don't let it end here. Like, share, and subscribe to this channel to stay connected with more powerful stories that matter. Spread the word about the need for transparency, accountability, and empathy in our institutions. Together we can keep that light shining, one story, one voice, and one act of courage at a time.